Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 127. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the talented comic creator of Stuffed Rock Studio, Dylan Goss. Dylan!
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's great to talk, and it's checking out. You have you have a pretty live Patreon page, which is fun to check out. You got an amazing ongoing series called Mara, which we're going to jump into and talk about as well. And great background story on this, great way of how you got it started. But first I want to kind of jump in and talk about, they talk about how you kind of started creating this. And I know that you started getting into comics by there's a legendary story that's going around that year. Father showed up with a pickup truck full of comic books and kind of got you started on something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yard sales are amazing, right?
Mostly Spider-Man, right? I heard
mostly Spider-Man.
Mostly Spider-Man. Yeah.
It was a lot of Marvel. I would say about 10% of it was DC, and almost all of that was Wonder Woman. Right. The rest was Marvel, Spider-Man, X-Men, New Mutants. I really liked New Mutants. Magic was something really new and exciting for me, right? Because she wasn't really like any other mutant that I had seen, Yeah. But then you had guys like Cypher who, your ability is really cool.
Yeah.
But maybe don't go fighting. Maybe stay home. Yeah. Work for the UN. You have a cool ability, but.
And so I'm just, when you mentioned that in previous podcasts, that showed up with it was mostly 70s and 80s. Every time I heard you mention that in previous interviews, I was thinking out loud, and I'm going to ask you the question out loud now that I have you here. Do you still have those comics?
My father has those comics.
Okay.
So we moved to Belize when I was pretty young. We took them with us, and I moved to Taiwan with my wife about 13 years ago, and I left the comics there.
Right.
So my father has them now.
Did you look them up to see if they're worth anything? You have any key issues or anything?
They're not in the best condition.
They're not.
Yeah.
Nothing like slab worthy that you'd probably get them slabbed or anything.
No, they were dog-eared before I ever got into it.
Oh yeah. Right. Oh, good. I had to ask you that question because I was wondering that from your other interviews. I'm like, well, where are they now? Are they? It's like, did you get any good ones? Yeah. So that's what kind of got you into comics, is that you were, basically, had a truck full, and that kind of got you started reading them. And so, as I think you're saying before too, it's like you really got in, you started writing early too, your idea of writing. And where along the lines did the story Mara come into place in your evolution of comic creating?
Well, I think the first seed of Mara came from Princess Mononoke. The whole wolf and girl trope. Yeah. And it's an iconic. It's a masterpiece. I'm not going to dance around that. It was a masterpiece. Right. Yeah. I of course know Conan the Barbarian. I don't think Barbarian would be in any of our vocabulary if not for Conan.
Right. Yeah.
And there's just something about this guy is just so much stronger that even though he has no armor to speak of, he can go up against overwhelming odds, right? That's the modern day Samson. and I like that because also He-Man, right. He-Man was a similar situation there, sword versus sorcery. And although there is a significant amount of magic giving Mara her powers, don't tell her that. Yeah, and what really sparked Mara herself, just as her characterization, as I was watching Logan in the theater, and Daphne Keene showed up on screen for the first time. That fight scene, she was quite feral. She was actually on all fours at some point during that, and they presented her as being very animalistic, and that really got the gears turning in my head. That was hugely inspiring for me.
Right. So talk a bit about Mara as a so she basically, this is a world that takes place that is, which I love the setting. So it's one of the things we'll talk about world building in a bit, but I love the idea of the setting that it is kind of an ancient but post-apocalyptic setting. So it's and she comes from a type of like an inspired Inuit culture, but now it's a dry, arid landscape. So talk to us about that setting you created.
So this setting was meant to be that they used to actually be more like the real world Inuits. They were a cold weather tribe. But there is no more cold weather. So they have, instead of ice fishing, they have the only river around. And water is very precious, and that's what sparked the tribal war, right? Because, everybody wants water for themselves. And if you were lucky and you happen to live there, well, good for you, but everybody else also wants to have that for themselves. And what started this well, this is a pretty severe global warming. This is more like a global catastrophe.
Right.
There was a war between the gods, which set the sky on fire. It has completely destroyed the day-night cycle. It is just constantly red all the time.
Because the sky is literally on fire.
Right? Yeah. Okay. So people who lived in warm climates at that time, of course, didn't make it. There was just no way to support life anymore there. And so Mara's tribe, the Rain, they had to adapt pretty quickly. They used to dress a lot warmer, of course. They used to do ice fishing. There's no more of that anymore. They were no longer self-sufficient. So they had to, instead of using their native language, they switched more and more to using the common language in the area so they could trade.
Okay.
And as they lost their native language, they lost some of their traditions. They no longer had the trials to determine who would be the wolf's champion. And because of that, there was no real defense against what came for them. It wasn't just some tribe with spears coming for them anymore.
Right.
And when there was only one person left, the wolf spirit said, okay, well, now I know who's the strongest because you're the only one. You logically have to be the strongest. And it was a bit of a loophole, but he wasn't willing to let everybody in the tribe die.
Right.
So even though Mara's not really the chosen one and not the best of the tribe for this, she hid the best and got lucky.
Right. So talk to us about a bit, just like the world building aspect that you had to do now, because you mentioned you're kind of inspired a little bit by, the Logan and Princess Mononoke. So did you have the kind of that character in your head first before you had the world around it?
Yeah. When I hired Rosie to be the illustrator, we had a few months of fleshing out the world before we started doing the comic at all.
Right.
And initially, Mara actually had a lot more Viking influence than Inuit. But you know, as I was working with the artist, this changed and evolved. And you know, because artists aren't just drawing robots, right? You give them an idea and you let them go, and if they come back with something you don't like, well, that's another discussion. But certain things have been changed because of Rosie's input. But I think the key there is that nothing was ever taken away, right? She's only ever added to the story. And that's why I'm willing to give as much creative freedom as I have, you know, because it's not just a one-man show, you know, we're a team, right?
Right.
And when I was hiring an artist, I had 3 people shortlisted, and I just told them, you know, I'll pay you for a commission. Give me a character concept of, you know, what you think Mara's like. And Rosie came back with something I wasn't expecting, but that ended up being my favorite.
And so did you, because of the other artists, are you looking at maybe some future projects with some of your other shortlisted artists?
Possibly. You know, I definitely have other comic ideas and scripts, and they're not remotely the same genre. You know, I've got a cyberpunk one in there, for instance. I've got a modern day one. I've even got a comedy one on the back burner.
Right. So what do you do as a comic creator and a writer? Talk to us a bit about the feedback loop you have. Like, for instance, is when you write out a script, like, for instance, like take an example, Mara, like your first, 12 pages or so. Was it just Rosie that looked at it, or do you have like some other people that also write that you got feedback from and some tips and editing advice on?
Yeah, absolutely. I also actually got feedback from other artists. The thing about writing is that everyone wants to write for themselves, which I think you should do. Absolutely. Because if you don't like what you're putting out, what are you doing? Right. But other people have to like it too.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to get caught up in your own head sometimes. You know, an idea will pop into your head and you'll have the details bouncing around in there, and you won't put them on the page because they seem obvious to you because they're in your head.
Right.
And if you don't have someone reviewing it, then you could end up putting a comic out there and people will be like, you never addressed this very important plot detail. so you have to have that. You know, I have a couple of friends who also write that give me feedback on that. Besides of course Rosie and the translators. I have 2 translators as well. And you know, because of how it's being released on Patreon, I am getting feedback, you know, as each page comes out.
Right.
Now, the page has already come out when I get that feedback, but it does still help. Behind the scenes, everyone who's reviewing it is a creator in some capacity. So that's going to skew their feedback a little bit. Feedback from someone who is primarily a reader has its own perspective that I wouldn't otherwise get.
Right. Which I found it interesting is that before we went live, you talked about you grew up in Belize. You live in Taiwan now. That, for me, knowing that kind of, I understand now, that explains of why the 3 translated versions you have, which is Portuguese, which is, obviously, spoken in Brazil, and also Spanish, as you mentioned before, in South America, but also the Chinese. Is it Mandarin, right?
Yeah, it's traditional Chinese, which is the writing used in Taiwan.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And so that helps. And so that makes. Is there any other ideas of to expand it out to other languages too?
Yeah, I've spoken to a Dutch and a Russian translator.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And so so side question for you, Dylan.
Yeah.
I love the ideas that you have for, it's where it's going. I just got to ask you, what's the origin of Stuffed Rock Studio? What is the origin name for that?
It's just my dumb sense of humor. I like the idea of a plush toy that is a rock. I find that idea very funny.
Right. And you had, and so getting back to the world building aspect of things, in Mara, how did you? So a lot of the question comes up. You start off with a character first, then you went from there. Mm-hmm. So, and then you went to. Did you start with the geography of it? Like, did you map it out? Did you have languages, different cultures? Where did you go from that? As you mentioned before, that Mara kind of in your head was kind of this idea of more of like a Viking culture is what you had initially in mind. Did you? And you said like the origin of the world it is was like a battle with gods. Did you start off also making a kind of like a pantheon of gods too, or how did you kind of first create the world?
It did start with a pantheon of gods, and what's left of the pantheon, because the war, there were clear winners and losers, but it was devastating on both sides.
Right.
So what we have left now is just a handful of gods. So that part was definitely a huge part of the initial world building. Also, Mara's tribe was actually a big part of that, because when we were doing this world building, the artist and I, her idea of approaching world building is that every person has a role to play in changing the world.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how minor of a character you are. You shape the world around you, and that in turn shapes other characters. So the idea was that Mara's tribe would shape who she is as a person.
Wow.
So that was a big part of it as well. The mapping out happened in a few different ways. There are in my notes. There's basically a network of caves and cities. The cities are kind of isolated by necessity. There just isn't a lot of drinkable water. There isn't a lot of anything really. Right. So people aren't really spread out. They cluster into these walled cities. One of the first cities they come across, nobody's allowed to leave without a merchant license, because just going out on your own is a death sentence.
And so, once you kind of, and then you also, you looking at the comics, you have different types of races and stuff. How did you also do deep dives into the evolution of different species, sentient species as well?
Absolutely. The elves are probably the best off in this world, because they're high magic. They can manipulate the world in various ways. They can even create water, which is which is a very precious ability. So they have some of the only nature around, really.
Right.
The humans are not terribly united, but they are the most prevalent species.
Right.
So, for instance, Pele is not affiliated with any of the people that we come across. His friend Benkeki was a childhood friend, and they've just been wandering around. They don't really have a tribe of their own at all, you know. And the insectoids are also a dying race. Orcs that we haven't seen yet were horribly devastated by the war because they don't have the infrastructure anymore to be a marching war band. You know, that would require carts of water, and that would require a lot of things that they just no longer have. And without that, they ended up just being mercenaries without tribes, and it's very difficult for them to survive like that. So they're quite rare.
Right.
The stone giants, like Jum is, they just have a lot of trouble surviving in this climate. He has adapted as best he can, but a lot of his people haven't been able to. And it's a very common story that people are just not able to adapt. Humans are the most adaptable species in this world, and that's why they have maintained their majority. But it's not looking good for them either.
So, do you have? As you mentioned, like you're looking at, we talked earlier about that you have like the kind of a 4-part for the first story arc. Do you see this as an ongoing series, or you have a definitive end to Mara?
There is a definitive end. Yeah. It's a little bit of a lengthy series. It's not fully written yet, but I'm estimating 20 chapters.
Okay. And then from that, do you see? So one of the other pieces to it is that when you put it together, do you have like the magic you mentioned earlier as well? Do you have, because you're a fan of the tabletop role playing games, do you have a very specific hard magic system, or is this more of like a soft magic system?
The magic that people are able to do definitely has limits based on how they acquired it. And elves have natural magic, but they can only do so much with that. Some elves have decided that's not enough for them and have gone on to acquire magic in other ways. And the thing that they fail to understand as a species is that magic isn't free. They treat it as though it is. Kalmor is very cavalier with his magic. He acts like it's infinite, but it's really not. And it does take a toll on the world.
Right. And what about, because with so then I got to ask you too, because you probably thought, maybe you must have already thought about this. Is there any plans on maybe taking an open source gaming license, or creating your own tabletop role-playing game, like a source book for Mara?
I probably wouldn't make an entire game for it, but I would consider releasing an adventure based on it, or a series of adventures. I would have someone who actually, writes adventures professionally do this, because while I am a GM, my notes are not worth publishing at all. Those are for me. And if anyone looks over my shoulder while I'm running the game, they won't learn anything.
Yeah. And what are some of your, what would be, getting back to working with Rosie. So, we have some comic writers that might be listening to this and saying, hey, you know what, you're able to find Rosie and say, like, I've kind of identified my own illustrator artist that I want to be working with. What's your advice from, say, like the business end perspective of contracts, or what would be some advice that you would give to other writers?
So the contract is meant to protect both of you. And what I would recommend is that you look up you can find a lot of templates online. You look up one of those. Don't try and write it from scratch.
Right.
There's a lot of boilerplate for a reason. Crank out the first draft and send it to the artist. Don't expect them to sign the first draft, because it is both ways. The other thing is, artists are not drawing robots. I mentioned that before. So you need to work out what level of detail they're expecting in the script. A lot of people will default to using the Marvel method. The Marvel method is good. It's good. I don't use it.
Right.
I went through a whole discussion on how the script should be formatted, what works best for both of us. And that's important, because if it doesn't work for you, the writer, it's not going to come out well.
Right.
Even if it's the format that your artist wants, it's not going to come out well. Right. So what we settled on actually just looks more like a narrative. It ends up looking more like a narrative with detailed physical descriptions. And that's what works for us. It might not be what works for you. Maybe the Marvel method works great for you, but figure that out first. Don't tell them you want the pages now and hand off a script that you haven't even asked about yet.
Right. And also too, like, what would be some of your advice on, say, like, deadlines and things like that, and for that as a writer working with an artist?
Well, definitely figure out what reasonable deadlines are before you start. Because the one I'm doing is ongoing. Instead of saying, okay, well, chapter 1 has to be done by this date, instead we go with, okay, well, we need to have 4 pages in the buffer. That's because, like, I might get sick, Rosie might get sick, or
right.
There's a holiday, or for some reason somebody has to take off for a little while. Right. If you are cranking it out close to the deadline, you're going to miss your deadline.
Right.
So you need to give yourself plenty of time for that. Whatever you think your deadline is, be early. And that might sound like simple advice, but it actually is difficult to maintain. Right. As a project manager, which you are going to be if you're the writer, if it's a creator-owned comic, as a project manager, you will very quickly realize that the human element is just so unpredictable.
Right. Yeah.
So give yourself as much extra time as you can. Twice what you think you need.
Right. And what are some of the, and you mentioned in previous interviews as well about some advice also on the networking aspect. How important do you see networking as making a creator-owned comic?
The thing about a creator-owned comic is that you also have to market it yourself. And your connections aren't just for advertising. Don't approach it that way, or nobody's going to like you. If all you do is you're gonna be the MLM aunt if that's all you do. But these people can actually help you, and often will. Not just in selling your comic, but in finding people to work with. And for instance, my original Portuguese translator couldn't do it anymore. He also does his own comics, and he has a podcast, and it was just, he didn't have the time. Right. And that's fine. We parted ways, favorably. Amicably. But I still needed another translator. Because I actually have, a network. I was able to reach out and say, hey, does anybody know a Portuguese translator? And I have a new Portuguese translator now. Right. If I didn't have a network, I would be shouting into the ether.
Right. Yeah. Is there any like online groups or things that you were able to connect with that you found has been really helpful in your networking and reaching out to other creators as well?
I've found that it's easier to connect with other creators on Twitter than it is on Facebook. Wow. Because Twitter has more of a discovery aspect to it.
Okay.
Facebook has groups, which are valuable. I've definitely found people to work with in groups, but it leaves a lot more of the discovery on you. So it's more manual, whereas Twitter is just people just happen upon you, and you'll just happen upon people. And so it's great for meeting new faces that way.
Right. Yeah. And part of your marketing strategy is all, do you have to, so how much do you put adage on the like the hashtags and stuff like that? What have you noticed that some of the hashtags that seem to really spark for your comic?
Hashtags are essential on Instagram. If you're not using at least a dozen hashtags, it's not going to get discovered. And I know that sounds like overkill, but that's what Instagram is.
Right. Yeah.
For Facebook, hashtags are not so great. They do exist and they do work, but nobody clicks on them, in my experience anyway. Yeah. What does work on Facebook is the groups.
Right.
You can share to groups, and then people will discover your work that way.
Right.
For Twitter, you have to use the hashtags. You have to use hashtags. You don't want to overload it like you would with Instagram. There just isn't enough space.
Right.
Yeah. You have to be very short and to the point with Twitter.
Right.
And you have to be constantly tweeting. Twitter moves so fast. If you have a smaller account, and by smaller I mean less than 10,000 people, you should be tweeting every hour. And I know I'm not doing that because that's exhausting. Even with the scheduling, it's exhausting. I know I don't tweet as much as I should, but there's only so much that I'm willing to do, because if I start resenting it, I'm not going to do very well.
Right. Yeah. Because you want to make sure that it still stays fresh for you in a way. You don't want to, right. You don't want to, there's that delicate balance of making your passion into a chore, because then you start losing your passion for it. Yeah. 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 So where do you see, so like, we're talking, getting back to Mara, what were some, as you're kind of approaching it, what were some of the surprises you saw that Mara did that you weren't expecting as a writer? Like, okay, this is the direction we're going. This is kind of new for me.
When I started, chapter one went largely as planned. And I know that is not really, that's not really what I said before, because she has more of an Inuit background,
right,
or influence, sorry, than I initially anticipated. But once I actually started, uh, getting the chapter 1 pages with my new look on the tribe, I wasn't too terribly surprised at the direction it went. It went pretty much as I expected. In chapter 2, the way she threw herself at the zombies, I know I wrote that, but then I saw that on the page, and I'm like, oh, I wrote that, didn't I? And she is meant to have a serious element of brutality. She is an avatar of revenge,
right. And
but
I was gonna say, because you got a I think you said in previous one, you got a 2-year-old right now.
I do, yeah.
Right. And so you were because of that being now very, very cognizant of, the ages of children. Was that having her be 8 years old? Was that just kind of a neutral number, or was there any reason behind having her be like 8 instead of say like 10, 13, or 5? Or
yeah. So the reason she's 8, there's a couple of reasons she's 8. First of all, I like the idea of characters that you can joke about as a general concept. Like,
right.
What if the strongest person you've ever met was an 8-year-old? This 8-year-old girl just moving 1-ton rocks like it's nothing, But she is played straight. Her age isn't much of a joke. Right. But I did want other characters to underestimate her.
Right.
At first glance, like Pele here is like, wait, little girl, don't do this, and then she kind of hulks out on him,
Right.
But the reason she's not even younger is that I wanted her to have some ability to understand the world around her.
Right.
Very, very young children, they're still trying to figure out a lot of things, right? At 5, I can't tell you very many memories I had from when I was 5, for instance, but I can tell you memories that I had from when I was 8. I'm very aware of how I was as an 8-year-old, and when I thought about it more, I realized that was the youngest age that I was very aware of, right? Because the further you go back, the more your memories are kind of blurred together, and you might remember something clearly, but then say, I guess I was 5 or 6 when that happened, and you're not really sure exactly when. But at 8, while you're still very young, and definitely not in any way capable of handling a situation like I've placed Mara in by yourself, you're still aware,
right?
Yeah.
And so when it comes to like the character development of the secondary characters, as the story kind of grows and expands, is there some ideas of having them take more of a central role, or is Mara going to be always going to be the lead protagonist in this?
Jum is possibly the most important side character.
Okay.
In this, he presents himself as a joke, but that's just how he presents himself.
Right.
I'll say this: without him around, Mara dies in chapter 8. Like, just not even point blank, she would die if he wasn't there.
Wow. Okay.
Pele is also very important because, I mean, he is the only normal person there. He is the only normal person, and I'm not even just talking about being a human. Like,
right.
Everybody else has some weird stuff going on, and he is the one straight man. And presenting the group with him in the front is pretty important.
Right.
You want to negotiate, you want to talk to a merchant, let's get Pele to do it.
Right. And you also, I think you also mentioned that you had this got started during COVID too. So this is basically like that it gave you that ability to kind of sit down and write this.
Yeah. I've never met my artist in person. Yeah. I mean, it really changed how we work.
Right.
Yeah, I've worked from home for a few years now for my day job, so that part didn't really change for me. But it changed how we socialize. It changed how, a lot of people were not used to working at home. Zoom was not in anybody's vocabulary. People were going out more, and with people not going out as much, they have found ways to try to capitalize on that. For me, I've actually been trying to figure out how I want to be a writer my entire life. I've tried various methods. At one point, I wanted to do video games, and I figured, I'm a software developer and I want to tell a story, so this should be the natural way of me doing it. Well, the problem there is that while a game can have a good story, that's not what makes a game good. And I was kind of just using the game as a vehicle to tell the story I wanted to tell, and that is setting yourself up for failure. Don't make a game if you just want to tell a story. There's a moral there.
It's unless it's one of those where they like the visual. What are they called? The
visual novels. Yeah,
visual novels. Yeah,
yeah. The that's how Fate got started, and Fate is a huge deal now, right? But I gotta respect that writer's effort. He didn't want to make an erotic visual novel, but that's what people wanted to buy. So he had some scenes shoehorned in just to get those buys, right? They didn't really make much sense in canon. They were just kind of there so he could say, yes, this is an erotic visual novel, please give me money so I can do the thing I actually want to do.
Right.
And it worked.
And you mentioned too before that that you being kind of like being invested in not only the tabletop role-playing game community but also in the comic book community. You did mention too that there seems to be more of a stronger community in the tabletop RPG world as compared to the comic book. Explain more on that.
So tabletop RPGs are inherently collaborative storytelling. There's dice, there's rules, but
right.
At the end of the day, it's a group of people sitting down and telling a story together.
Right.
So I think it promotes community just inherently. Right. Comic books, you get crossovers sometimes, you get people working with each other, but by and large, comic creators don't really work together. Right. I feel like, it just doesn't promote community in the same way. And I would love to be able to change that. I would love to be able to connect to more creators. There are definitely some creators who are amazing people in the community. I did a crossover with the creator of Glyn in Monsterland.
Okay.
That it was just a non-canon 2-panel short, and then their illustrator did like a cover art of the two characters. That was just a fun little crossover we did. But I've also had some brief conversations with Dan Panosian on Twitter, and he's a great guy. If you want, if you're having a bad day and you want to boost up, just talk to that guy. He'll cheer you right up. Jim Zub was actually super helpful when I was in the planning stage, and he has his DMs open on Twitter, so I just messaged him. It's like, hey, you have any advice for a new comic writer? And he said, well, Dylan, as a matter of fact, I do. Here's my blog I set up with all of the advice columns that I've written for new writers.
Oh, wow.
But yeah. So he actually has this. Yeah, it's a Tumblr blog, and there's a lot of advice there for writers. Oh, wow. Yeah. And if none of that applies to you, you're probably not doing comics.
And so, and have you been able to, like, for instance, in some of those situations, have you been able to, get some tips, tricks of the trade that you've been able to directly utilize in your comic books?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it actually just occurred to me. I've been saying this over and over, and it just occurred to me that I got this from Jim when I said that artists are not drawing robots. That's actually a direct quote from his blog. And I only just remembered that now that I'm talking about it, right? I've been saying that without attributing him, because I just adopted that as my own philosophy. Right. So, but thinking like that actually has been very helpful, because it's easy to think, oh, I'm paying this person, they should do what I want. But it's not just, you're not hiring somebody to move your furniture. You're hiring a creative person, and creative people work best when they're allowed to use their creativity.
Right.
And I feel like if you give an artist some amount of freedom, because obviously you want to get your script drawn up.
Right.
Obviously. But if you give them some amount of freedom, you will actually get back more. Because, like I said before, none of Rosie's changes were removals. They were all additions. They all added to it. I haven't felt like any decision she's made has made the comic worse.
Okay.
It has only made it better.
Wow. Is there just I'm kind of curious about some of your other stories. Are they in a shared universe, or are they completely different? As you mentioned, you had like a cyberpunk idea, you had a kind of a comedy one and a modern one. Is there any shared universe? Like, do they take place in other parts of the timeline of the world that you established with Mara?
No, because I don't want to be limited by any other stories.
Okay.
If I had to connect, say, the modern day one to Mara, or even the cyberpunk one to Mara, then I would have to build off of that world, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does limit my options. And okay. I don't want my options to be limited.
Okay.
I see with Marvel all the time, they're constantly having to, especially in the 70s comics, there would be a little asterisk when somebody was talking, and it's like, oh, well, he's talking about this thing that happened in this comic that you don't have. Right. FYI. And I don't really want to have to do that. I don't right. want to have to say, well, wolves are the dominant species because Mara, right?
Right.
I don't want to have to say that technology evolved a certain way in the cyberpunk one because of how I wrote the modern one, and that's because of how I wrote Mara. Right?
Right.
Everything is kind of separate, so I can do whatever I want with it.
Right. So yeah, this is big. We're already at our hour mark already, Dylan. So this was just like that, man.
Yeah, just like that.
So people can, if people are interested in reading, they can actually go to mara-comic.com to actually read. It's right there. You also have your Patreon that I highly recommend people to check out, which is they get they get their pages earlier. You also get, you can also at the $10 level, they also get some sketches. Do you want to explain that? What was that about?
Yeah. So people would get the progress shots of pages as they come out. So the rough sketch and the ink those are the two main ones, right? Sometimes you'll get reworks. Like we'll be doing it, and either I will say, well, I don't think it should be this way, or Rosie will say, I actually did not end up liking how I originally did it. Which has happened a couple of times. I'll look at the page and I'll say, yeah, this is good, and she'll come back the next day and say, that actually wasn't my best work. Here is what it should be. Yeah. So you get to see those reworks as well.
Right. And also too, you have kind of two websites. You got your Mara comic, but you also have your Stuffed Rock Studio, which is basically your kind of like your launching point, your drop point here. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a placeholder, right. But we don't have a huge amount of content for it because there's only the one comic.
Right. So far. Yeah.
Yeah. So far. Yeah. We've got a little bit of info on there about the team and stuff like that. But the website you really care about is the comic website.
Right. That's where you can actually read the comic book and everything. Cool. Well, hey, listen, Dylan, when you get ready to, you mentioned before, there's going to be a point where you're going to get all 4 chapters together for a Kickstarter. Come back on, man. This is good. You have basically a page every week comes out.
Yeah, that's what we're doing right now.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dylan. And it was a great pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to being here when I have that book for you.
Cool. Excellent. Did you ever do any do you Storytell Exalted? You said you run that GM it?
Yeah. We played mostly 2.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's different than how much different is the second edition to first edition?
Well, first edition is really its own beast entirely.
Right.
It has the hallmarks of an old system, but it's definitely worth checking out.
Right.
I recommend everybody check it out. And if you're interested in Exalted, because they lay so much groundwork there that they just don't in second edition.
Right.
White Wolf is not good at consolidating.
It's there's so many contradictions. You can tell they just contracted out writers, and this it's wait, you said something completely different in this other splat. I don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, remember when anybody could write anything about Star Wars and just have it be canon as long as they bought the license?
Yeah.
I feel like they kind of did that with their contractors.
Yeah.